In this session, we are going to be talking about how we can estimate software and what tools we can use to be able to generate software estimates quickly. I started with this example from the movie The Phantom Menace, better estimates, no phantom figures, or menacing miscommunication. One of the reasons I went with this is there's this, well, we're in a movie theater. I needed some kind of movie tie-in, right? But also, there's this interesting moment in The Phantom Menace, the first time that Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan encounter Darth Maul. They don't know what he is. Qui-Gon and Anakin are trying to escape back to the ship, and they encounter Darth Maul, and there's this fight, and Qui-Gon really just kind of has to run away. And when he gets back in the ship, Obi-Wan asks him, what is that? And Qui-Gon says, I don't know, but it was well trained in the Jedi arts. And there's two things from that statement that I think can be helpful to us as we're estimating software. Qui-Gon tells him what he does know and how well he knows it. And as software developers, when we have to estimate the duration of software projects, I think that is instructive for us. We are pretty good at telling stakeholders what we know. How long do we think this is going to take? What we don't often do, and what I want to implore you to do, is to communicate how well we know that number. And we'll look at how to do that. My other idea for tying this presentation into the movie theme was this movie. How many of you have ever been asked to give an estimate and you kind of knew that it was a lie, but you had to give an estimate? Yeah, this is pretty common. I feel like I have been in this script many times and like, well, I had to give an estimate. I was not given enough information. Luckily, I've got a 20-sided die and a magic 8-ball. So here we go. You wanted a number, I gave you a number. So the challenge when we're doing estimation is a function of what we know and when we know it. So if we plot out a software project and we plot what we know against the time frame, our knowledge grows at a curve that looks something like this. But where do we usually have to do the estimation? Right up front, right when we know the least. So we are being tasked to say, like, hey, tell us what you know. Like, well, we don't really know much. You're like, man, a couple months, once we start building this, we'll know a lot more. And so when we're doing estimates in the project, once we have some objective data about how things are going, we can estimate differently. And that's kind of another topic. What I want to think more about today is when we're in the phase of the project, when we're thinking about, should we do this project? Once we are further into the project, a lot of times we're more interested in answering the question, when will this feature be done? And when we're asking that kind of question, we have the opportunity to use objective metrics. We can look at the team velocity. We can possibly run Monte Carlo simulations. We can forecast out based on what we know. But once we're into the project, we often know more about the technology we're using. We understand more about the team. So what happens when we're early in the project, or probably before the project, and we have to do an estimate? So this is the problem that I'll be addressing today. I remember in what feels like far too many years ago now, I was a freshman in college, and I was in my chemistry class. I had a great chemistry professor. And I forget exactly what lab we were doing, but I needed to measure how much some sample weighed. So I got the scale. I knew how to use a scale. Did the tare appropriately, put the sample on there, and in my lab notebook dutifully wrote down that it weighed 1.41 grams. Is that a Is 1.41, is that a precise number in that case? Kinda, yeah? And up to that point, that had been all I needed to know. But my chemistry professor, Professor Messick, walked up and said, Eric, that is not what you need to record, because when the scale says 1.41, really that means that it could be anywhere from 1.406 to 1.415. And I said, but does that really matter? And he laughed and said something along the lines of, I have a lot to teach you, which he did. And so the more accurate, the more precise thing to say in that situation is that the sample weighs 1.41 plus or minus 0.005 grams. So this idea of having some kind of plus or minus on the fact or on the measurement is what we call the measurement uncertainty. And I think we can bring this into how we do estimation, because we can communicate the lack of clarity that we have at the beginning of a project. So when we're estimating at this point in a project life cycle, what would be more accurate would be to say, we don't think that this will take 5 months. We think this will take 5 plus or minus 1 month. And it's that plus or minus 1 that I want to talk about how we can get today. That factor right there. So this lack of clarity that we get in this number can come from a lot of things. And we are early in the project, there's a lot of things we don't know. And the lack of clarity could come from technical aspects. I'm sure I'm not the only one in here that has started on a project with some new technology. Maybe I'm integrating with a new third-party API. Maybe I'm running on a new platform. I was a part of an effort not too long ago where we had to port an iOS application to an Android application. We knew a lot about what the project had to do. We just weren't sure how we were going to be able to build it and what it was going to take to get it running on a new platform. There could be a lack of organizational clarity. A lot of times you're estimating how long a project is going to take before you know what the team is going to look like, who's going to be on it, how many people are going to be on it. And so you need to represent that in your estimates. There is often a lack of functional quality. We don't exactly know what the software needs to do. The stakeholders have a general idea, but possibly at this point when we're doing the estimate, we haven't really refined all the user stories. And so we're kind of estimating in a range because of the range of things that might have to be implemented. And of course, we also have to deal with integrational unclarity. So what happens when we have a third-party system that is unfamiliar to us and we have to build around it? But the key thing that I want to communicate here is that single value estimates hide information. If I am just providing a single value to my stakeholders, I am not telling them everything that I know about what I don't know. I'm not telling them what I know about the risks. And when we're doing software estimates, there's this trade that we can always make. We can always get more clarity by investing more time. And it's a trade that we can make whenever we want. One of the things that is generally true is that as developers, there are better things that we could be doing with our time than doing longer estimations. Is there anyone in the room that really loves long estimation sessions? I'm going to take that as a no. I probably knew that before I asked the question. I think we can all agree. It's probably not universally true, but most of us would say we would provide more value in this situation if I was building something, not estimating how long it would take to build it. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is how can we communicate better, but spend less time getting to those values. Is anyone here familiar with either PERT estimation or three-point estimation? Do I have anyone in the room that's done that? This is a really robust way to generate estimates. I think really highly of the process. It is well thought out. But the idea is that for every line item that we estimate, we're going to estimate a best, a worst, and a most likely case. And when you do this, it forces you to think about the risks in the project, and you can communicate a range of values, which is valuable. But if you do a proper 3-point estimate, you're going to invest much more time in it. I don't know that it takes 3 times as much time to do a proper 3-point estimate, but it certainly takes more time. There's another topic here that I just kind of want to skim over the top of, and that's the whole idea of no estimates. I certainly think there is a time and a place where no estimates is incredibly valuable to our industry. That's just not this context that I'm talking about today. Obviously, if we can get around not doing estimates, then we don't have that time investment, so we're winning the trade there. But there has to be some other way that we're getting that clarity. And a lot of times with the no estimates audience, we can get that clarity from past performance of the team and knowledge about how the team creates cards and how quickly they can create cards. If that is the context that you're in and you can move forward in a no estimates situation, I encourage you to investigate that. I'm not going to talk about it today too much, other than this one slide. What I want to talk about is what happens when we do have to have estimates. And the reason that we often have to have these early estimates comes from constraints that you may or may not be under. Sometimes you're doing projects or you're proposing a project with a partner or a client, and they have a very fixed budget. In the past, I've worked for software consulting agencies. We would sometimes do projects for smaller companies that simply had really small budgets or nonprofits, and they didn't want to start a project that they weren't going to be able to fund to completion. And so they needed to know up front, what can I get for X amount of dollars? Or can I get what I want for this amount of dollars? That is an important conversation for those stakeholders. And in those situations, we often have to do estimates. The other constraint that we see a lot is schedule. We need to know for a lot of projects, can we get this done by a certain date? A lot of times, you might be in situations where it doesn't matter how long it's going to take, you just have to do it. In those cases, you don't have to estimate as well. I work for Sweetwater. How many Sweetwater fans do we have in the room? Yeah, we got a couple. Sweet, awesome. We're the largest retailer of music and pro audio gear in North America. And as you might guess, for a retailer, having certain features in production by Black Friday is a big thing every year. And so at the beginning of the year, we sit down, we estimate all the things we want to do and try and figure out what can we get done in time for Black Friday this year. And things that don't fit get pushed out. There are other things that we do that are just like constant, like we have a Kanban board and they're just flowing through. And we don't spend as much time estimating those. But some of these big things that are more calendar specific, we just have to estimate. As a side note, shameless plug, I'm currently trying to hire some good QA people. If you have some good QA people that would love to work at Sweetwater, it's an awesome company, come find me after the talk. One other thing that I want to make clear is that we have different definitions of the word estimate. When I use the word estimate, I want to be clear that an estimation is not a commitment. There are times when you might be working on a software project and the budget and the schedule is ironclad for whatever reason. And in those cases, you might need a commitment. And if you have a commitment, then you need a lot more clarity. And if you need more clarity, then you're going to need to put more time into it. For most of us, our estimates are for planning purposes, they're not commitments. And so we want to minimize the amount of time estimating so that we can get back to higher value things. So what do we want from our estimates? We want better clarity about how long a project could take. We want better communication with stakeholders. And we want faster ways to generate estimates. So here's the approach that I'm going to propose. We're going to estimate every line item with a t-shirt size and a clarity score. The clarity score is just a value from 1 to 10 that indicates how much clarity do we have about this line item when we're estimating it. And then we're going to calculate a range of potential time values. The nice thing about running calculations is that computers can do them really fast. I don't know, that's maybe what computers are built to do. And so if I can figure out some functions to generate a time range based on t-shirt size and clarity score, the computer can help me generate the rest of the estimate really quickly. I do want to give a shout out here because there is a Pluralsight course called Easily Estimate Projects and Products by William Davis. This Pluralsight course was very influential in my thinking, and he does a much deeper dive into some of the statistical approaches I'll show. He also, the author, William Davis, on his website, statisticalpert.com, has some nice spreadsheets that you can use. My preference, when I generate estimates, I actually use a significantly simplified version of what he does. But if you want to know more about why I use the math that I use, it generally comes from this author. So when we talk about doing line item estimates in t-shirt sizes, one of the reasons we want to do that is we want to minimize how much time we're spending in an estimate. I have been in estimation sessions where two developers were arguing whether or not something would take 18 or 20 hours. I appreciate that someone laughed at that. And the reality is that 2-hour difference was well within the noise of what that estimate was going to actually be. There are times when you're debating some of those finer points, and it is worth capturing those notes because that might lead to something that can be investigated later. But for the sake of time, for the sake of the group, it's better to just be like, hey, we're going to have t-shirt sizes. I typically lean towards 1 day, 2 days, 1 week, 1 sprint, 2 sprints as my t-shirt sizes. Use whatever works for you. I think this works out well because why argue if something's going to take 18 or 20 hours? It's okay. It's going to take 2 days. Let's get on with life. And we can use the t-shirt size to generate our most likely estimate. And then from there, we can calculate a 3-point estimate of our best case and our worst case. And by default, we can just say our best case is going to be 80% of our median, and worst is probably about 200%. Those are very subjective, like finger in the air percentages. Don't take those as gospel. Tweak those for your organization. So when we use these t-shirt size estimates, that allows us to shrink the time. One of the reasons why I think that when we calculate the score that we need to have a much larger factor to get to the worst case scenario is that I'm sure if we could just have a nice conversation about past estimates, you've probably seen a lot more estimates go much longer than much shorter. Part of that is because there are only so many ways that a feature or an effort can get smaller, while there are many, many ways for a developer task to go much longer. One of the really interesting ones is the coastline paradox. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but the idea is that when you measure the coastline of some island, or anything that, I guess, any region that borders the ocean, it's actually much harder than you might think to figure out how much coastline there is. Because if you measure with larger segments, you're going to get a much smaller number. The smaller line segments you use, the larger the number you're going to get, and it's often by an order of magnitude. And so when you are thinking about things for your software project early on and just kind of roughing things in, this means that you're going to, almost by definition, find more work as you get into the work and start doing more of it. So I keep talking about being able to calculate our range. We want to come up with a function that we can give a size and a clarity, and it's going to spit out a min and a max. One of the nice things we can use here, a mathematical tool we can use, is our normal distribution. So we can use our mean value as a way to generate a bell curve, and we can use our clarity, we can map our clarity onto a standard deviation and adjust the size of that bell curve. So if we have a lower clarity, that bell curve becomes wider. If we have a really high clarity, that bell curve becomes really narrow. In the middle, we have our standard bell curve, obviously, and once we have this bell curve, now we can do some interesting mathematical things where we can take samples on that bell curve and generate a range based on those data points. So with my bell curve, if I want to be 90% confident that the high end of my range is something we can accomplish, I can just grab the 90th percentile, and now I can say, like, okay, when I report this, I can say, I think this will take 2 weeks, but I'm 90% sure that we can get it done in 88 hours, whatever the number is. For my purposes, I generally take the 25th percentile as our best case, or our better case, and the 90th percentile is our worst case. Again, those things might depend on the project. Those things might depend on just how much confidence you need to have in that estimate. The other thing that's nice about this from a communication standpoint is when I tell a stakeholder the range, I can also say, I am 90% confident that we can get this done within this time range. And that still communicates to him that there is at least a small chance that we won't. And we can mitigate that in various ways. So when we're doing our estimate, we can build up a table, and we might have different tasks, and we can calculate the range. So the first task might be that we need to build the UI. And we think that is a medium with a clarity of 8, and then we're going to calculate the price of the order, also a medium, but for various reasons, the clarity is only 3. And then we also have to integrate with the tax API. We know that's smaller, but our clarity is a 4. So with this estimate, you can see I have 2 items that are both a medium, but because the different clarities are different, the ranges are also different. So for the first item, the range that was calculated was 41 to 54 hours. With less clarity, it's blown out to 35 to 65. Oops. And so what I can do is I can just sum up the minimum and the maximum, and I can report to my stakeholders how long the project could take, and I can give them a range, and so they have a more realistic idea of what the project could take. The other thing that's nice is that when I have a table like this, or a spreadsheet that looks like this, I can now improve communication with the stakeholder. I had a situation recently that this example is kind of inspired by, where there was something along the lines of calculating price that actually had to do with all the different ways that we can apply discounts for customers. And we showed it to the stakeholder and said, hey, this is how long we think this will take. We do have this one low clarity item. And it was the fact was that this item lacked functional clarity. We had been asked to estimate something before we had done a proper requirements analysis. And I was so proud of the stakeholder because he looked at that and he didn't push back on us and be like, oh, you guys should have done a better estimate. The first thing he said was, okay, I've got an SME. I'm going to task him right now to write up the full specification of what we need so that by the time we get to developing this particular feature, we can make sure that we are hitting the low end of this estimate and not kind of doing the discovery as we go along. And if I had just guessed at how long I thought that thing would take, we wouldn't have been able to have that interaction. He couldn't have been proactive in helping me make sure that that part of the development effort was successful. And so when we have a low clarity item like this, a lot of times what we can do is that we can investigate the requirements, and help the project move forward more successfully. Oh, I forgot I had, yeah. The stakeholder in this case, he saw that and he's like, yeah, you just have to, we have to get this other person involved. He can take care of that. There have been plenty of other items that I have estimated over the years where we're integrating with some new technology. And if the stakeholders are concerned about the low clarity of that estimate, we can say, well, we can go back and we can just do a proof of concept. Give us a little bit of time, let us investigate what this is going to take. We can do that idea where we trade time for clarity, and in this case, we'll trade time building software with this new technology, and we come back and we'll have a lot more clarity about how long this will take. All right, I was going to do a demo here. As you saw, we switched laptops, and I don't have the spreadsheet on this laptop. I apologize. If anyone wants to see some more specifics about how these estimates work in practice, find me later. One of the reasons I have come to be convinced that this idea of estimating with clarity and range is so important is what it does for our communication. So as a developer, I'm often tasked with communicating some project duration to the stakeholder. And in the past, I would just give him or her some amount of time. I think this will take 6 months. And based on that information, the stakeholder would reply, either they wanted to move forward with it, they didn't want to move forward with it. In some cases, they would use that information to figure out how to staff the team, all kinds of things. But if I am giving incorrect or if I'm giving information that isn't as precise as it could be, the feedback that comes back to me is also not going to be as precise as it should be. If I communicate to my stakeholders with a size and a clarity score, I'm also communicating to them the risks that I see, and they can help me mitigate that. I am communicating the range of possible project durations, and that allows them to plan accordingly. It also allows me to communicate the known unknowns. What are the things that I know we don't know yet? There's no tool that would allow us to communicate our unknown unknowns, right? That's kind of by definition impossible. But we want to communicate as well as we can. Now, in software, there are no silver bullets, there are only trade-offs. And I want to be clear about what this technique can and can't do for you. It's not perfect. Communication is still hard. It just is. There are things that will happen when you communicate in ranges and with clarity scores that some people might misinterpret. They might interpret low clarity as low confidence. And so when you're communicating in this way, you have to maybe educate the stakeholders as to what you really mean and what you really know. If you're in a situation where you are bidding on work against other companies, it can sometimes be seen as detrimental because you are more communicative in telling the potential client their whole range, and then someone else might be, I don't want to say lying, but they're not being as accurate as they could, and their number looks better than yours. So I have definitely been in situations where we used this technique internally and then picked a single point estimate that we delivered to the potential client because it helped us bid well against the other companies. And even when we estimate like this doesn't prevent scope creep or doesn't prevent feature discovery. You're still going to have situations where you estimate something takes a year and then you discover some really valuable things along the way, and you're going to add those to the project because they add business value, and that is not going to be in line with the original estimate, and that's okay. You just have to communicate about those to your stakeholders. Really quickly, there are other things that you're going to have to take into account when you do these estimates. How are you going to account for sprint ceremonies? I'm assuming you guys are doing your sprint ceremonies. I have seen teams do this two ways. Sometimes the developers will do the estimate, and they say, I think this will take 2 weeks, and that includes the time that we are in sprint planning, in retro. Sometimes they say, well, I think this will take 80 hours of developer time, and then we have to account for sprint ceremonies and other meetings outside of that. I've seen both work. Depending on what you need to do, pick one and just account for it. You can either add it in after the fact or account for it in your estimates. Your projects will also have some combination of other factors. How much project management time does your project need, QA, UX, et cetera. If you can, look at past project performance, because a lot of times the amount of QA time that is needed for a project is a function of how much dev time is needed. In the past, at a past employer, we could fairly accurately predict that QA time was going to be 15% of the dev time for web apps and 25% if it was mobile apps. And so if you can run those calculations, you can add that into your estimate nice and quickly. For longer running projects, make sure you account for PTO. Your teammates are humans. They deserve breaks. And also make sure that your estimates account for focus. Some teams have the luxury to be completely heads down on a project. A lot of teams are supporting other platforms, and they know that maybe they can only work on new development 80% of the time. If that's the case, account for the fact that your developers are only going to be working on the estimated work 80% of the time. So, because we got a late start, so I'm not going to do questions here. If anyone has any questions, find me in the hall afterwards, or find me at lunch, and we can discuss that. Good point. If someone has questions they want to throw in the Discord channel, I will be in there later to answer questions. So, big takeaway. Report estimates like this. Report to your stakeholders each line item, the size, the clarity, generate a range, show them what you're going to do. When you report the clarity and the range of the estimate, you'll improve the communication you have with your stakeholders and improve project outcomes. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of your conference.